this is why we need to replace the brakes. Woo-wee! Did this thing come out looking real pretty. Now, I'm not gonna be tracking my GTR. At least I don't foresee myself tracking it anytime in the near future. So what I did was I looked for the best budget brakes on the market for the GTR platform. And Speed by Designs sells a fully bundled kit, which means you get the rotors, front and rear, as well as the pads for both the front and rear. Now, if you have not yet joined the community and hit that subscribe button, go ahead and hit the subscribe button and the notification bell. This way you can stay up to date on all of my GTR build series content. Now let's go ahead and jump into today's video. Roll the intro. There's one more thing that I forgot to mention that I ended up purchasing with this kit as well, and that's gonna be titanium screws for the rotor hats. As you can see, my hardware on the factory setup is all rusted and nasty, so I figured it would be a good time to change out the hardware to the rotor hats as well. A few other items that I recommend you purchasing if you're gonna be planning on doing this job yourself is some brake cleaner, some caliper grease, some anti-seize, either a brush like this that has this kind of compound, or a wire wheel brush will do as well. Some zip ties will also be good to have. Now, right now, I am not wearing work on your car attire, as you can see based on my super fresh dunks. So I'm gonna go inside, change real quick, put on some clothes that we can work on the GTR in. Then we'll go ahead and get all these factory components off and get all the new stuff by Speed by Design on. Now that I'm all changed, before we go ahead and get these out of the package and clean them up, like prep the surface for installation, let's go ahead and get, why do you look so awkward? Anyways, so before we can go ahead and prep those things, or not before we can, before we should go ahead and prep those new ones, let's go ahead and get the front wheel off, because that's where we're gonna start, and get all this factory components off. All right, so the first thing that we're gonna start with here is we're gonna go ahead and take these two off, these two, and then loosen up this whole bracket area. This way it gives us slack when we start taking off the caliper. Now we're gonna go ahead and move on to these two pins right here. Now behind, in order to remove these, there is two 13mm nuts right back here that you just gotta go ahead and take out. Next, let's go ahead and remove out this top pin here and this bottom pin here. I'm gonna be using a 5/32 pin in order to do this. Pay attention to the orientation on these tabs, by the way. There is an arrow marking up here, and same thing on the bottom, because you're gonna need it in this exact same order when you go ahead and install the new stuff. A little trick for those of you who might not be able to have the right hammer or a punch that can reach all the way back here, and you do need to loosen it up, take the same bolt that you had taken out of it, put it in just slightly, just enough that there's some space so you can go ahead and loosen it up, and then as you see, give the bolt a few taps, loosen it up a little bit more. You'll be good to go to pull these things out. Now, let's pop out these pads. Damn, these things were messed up. That is bad. That's like real bad. Yeah, look at these two on this side. Look at that cracking. Holy crap. These things are super freaking old.
Brother, what's that? What's that, brother?
Well, I don't think these have ever had a brake job done on this GTR. Now, I'm gonna be putting out a video on this in the future, but this is one of the things that when you buy a used GTR, no matter how low the mileage is, it's really important that you check the brakes, because there's a high probability, or at least factor it into your cost of your purchase, because there's a high probability that you're gonna have to replace the brake rotors and the brake pads. The good news is Speed by Designs makes a really budget-friendly system like the one we're installing today on the GTR, so you don't have to factor in too much craziness into the cost of your build. So two more tips that I want to leave you all with. The first thing is when I take off brake pads, I typically leave them at the job site area. The reason for that is so I know exactly at quick glance which way they came out. Of course, you can just take pictures. This is just my way of doing it. And before I go ahead and remove the caliper and the rotor from the vehicle, I like to clean all this stuff off. Since you already have it off, I like to remove all the rust and clean it up, make it look new again. These disposable paint trays are really good for stuff like this. I pretty much do all of my restoration of like bolts, nuts, screws in these things, because once I'm done with this, I could just go ahead and toss it. I don't have to do any cleanup here. And then WD-40 works wonders on all these old bolts and nuts and parts. let's go ahead and get these things cleaned up and renewed. Now we're moving on to the last thing. So first things first is we're gonna go ahead and break free these two 10mm Allens, one on the bottom and then one up here on the top. Now be ready, once you remove this bottom one and then you loosen up this top one, be ready to hang up your caliper somewhere up here. So that's what we're gonna be using those zip ties for that I showed you earlier. And then what I would recommend hanging off of up here is this top control arm. I almost forgot to mention this, but there's one really long bolt right here that you have to loosen up and pull out as well. Just to show you here, and it is highly recommended based on how hard this top one was to get off, or at least to unloosen, I'd highly recommend using a breaker bar. I'm using this freaking, how long is this thing? I don't know, it's the really long size. Highly recommend using a breaker bar to remove these bolts, because I couldn't imagine doing this with like a really small ratchet. Unless of course your brakes have been done before, and in that case it's probably already been loosened. And by looking at these rotors, I'm probably 100% correct when I say these are the ones that came on the factory, or I should say came out of the factory. These things just look super bad. Now your front rotor should literally just pop right off. Now, while you have your brake rotor off, something I'd recommend, which is why I showed you from the very beginning, I'm gonna go ahead and use the wire wheels that I was showing you, as well as the other compound disc, to go ahead and clean up behind here and just give this some new life again. Just taking a look at the rotor here and just kind of inspecting it, aside from like all the rust everywhere, I noticed that there's cracking going on in this thing. Now, we're gonna go ahead and remove all of the hardware here. We are gonna need to keep these top clips as well as this piece that they're connected to. And then I wanna go ahead and get this thing cleaned off. Actually, I might clean it off while it's on here. It might make it a little bit simpler for me. Yeah, let's go ahead and do that. Let me clean this off real quick, and then we'll go ahead and remove the top hat from the disc itself. Okay, so first, the OEM rotor. Let's get the weight on this. And we have 21.6 pounds on the factory OEM GTR rotor. And then now, on the Speed by Design rotor, we also have 21.6 pounds, which is crazy because these are slotted, but they're not drilled, which means if we went with the drilled version or the slotted and drilled version, we would have ended up with a slightly lighter piece than the OEM one. Now, I'm sure some of you are wondering, why did I go with the slotted rotors over the drilled rotors, like the ones that come on the GTR from the factory? Now, everybody's gonna have their mixed opinions on this. Personally, I think for street use purposes, slotted rotors are the better route to go. I've seen the drilled rotors crack more, same thing like my OEM one, so it is something that I recommend avoiding on the street if possible. And once again, this is just my personal opinion. Do your research, go to Reddit, go to Quora, go to Google, read the forums. Everybody's gonna have their own opinions on what they'd prefer to use for street use and or track use as well. For those of you who have never done brake rotors on a car before, hopefully the GTR is not your first time, but if it is your first time doing brake rotors, don't mess it up because it's gonna be a very expensive mess up. That's for one. But for two, you do need to, on the brake rotor itself, you need to clean off the grease that comes on it. Do not install rotors with this grease on there from the factory. The reason that they put this grease on, it's like an anti-corrosive film. So all we're gonna do is we're gonna take some Brakes Park Cleaner, a microfiber cloth, and just clean this surface off really nice without any oils or anything on it. Because anything that's on here can transfer over to the brake pads, which will affect your braking performance. All right, so just like the factory hardware, the bolt goes through the bottom, the nut is what sits on top. Now you're gonna be tightening this down to either 8 foot-pounds, or what that's converted over to is 96 inch-pounds. Woo-wee! Did this thing come out looking real pretty. Man, I'm excited to get this thing onto the GTR already. Wow, those titanium bolts and nuts look really, really freaking nice on this thing. Not to mention the absolutely dramatic weight savings that we're gonna get from having titanium bolts and nuts on our rotor hats. I'm just kidding, obviously. The reason why I did it is for the anti-corrosion benefit that you get from having titanium bolts and nuts, but also it looks really cool. It's aesthetically pleasing. I almost forgot something. So we cleaned this up. As you can see, looks so much nicer now. Let's go ahead and put some anti-seize on all around this contact patch back here. Also, the dust guard cleaned up really, really nice. Now we need to be really careful with touching this brake pad surface, but what we're gonna go ahead and do is apply some of our brake caliper grease, just a light coating right here to the back of the brake pad. Now for the 2 Allen bolts here, these are gonna be torqued down to 74 foot-pounds. This middle bolt is gonna be 18 foot-pounds. And then these 2 bolts right here are gonna be torqued down to 22 foot-pounds. All right, and that's it. This is what everything looks like buttoned back up. Came out really good. Everything went in super smoothly. Now what I'll go ahead and do is I'll get the wheel back on the passenger side. We'll go ahead and do the exact same thing on the driver's side of the GTR, then we'll move on to the rear. All right, so I just finished up the driver's side front. Now that the fronts are completely done, let's go ahead and move on to the rear. It's a little bit different, not by much, but a little bit different, so we'll go ahead and walk through the rear. We'll start off by removing these pins. For those who can't tell, the reason why it's so difficult is because this is on a spring system set up on the rears. So if you remove either the top or bottom first, it's gonna be a little bit difficult to pull the other pin out. But with a little bit of tugging, it comes out, so it's not that big of a deal. The same thing that we did on the fronts, we're gonna do on the rear. So top bolt, bottom bolt. The only difference is this one doesn't have a middle bolt, so be ready. Oh, that was much easier than the fronts. So something a little bit freaky on the rears is because once you do the fronts, you're gonna notice that it's super simple to do the fronts. This thing pretty much falls off. On the rear though, it is always super, super tight on these things. So you are gonna have to hammer it a little bit, and don't be afraid to hammer this one off. You're gonna have to bang it up a little bit, like bang it back and forth in order to get this thing off. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna take a rubber mallet, we're just gonna bang around until this thing pops right off. Whew, all the freaking rust is crazy. Oh boy. Oh, that's nasty. Whew. Well, we got it off at least. The rear rotor is also done now, but something that I think I'm gonna go back and do in the future, there was a ton of rust buildup right here. I think what I'm gonna do, I'll install it on the GTR for now, but I'm gonna go back and paint this after with some high heat matte paint, just because I don't care to leave it like bare metal like that. But there was just too much rust to leave it on there. So I had to remove all the rust that was there. Anyways, now to get it back onto the GTR. Oh, I almost forgot to show you guys this. I also cleaned this up as well and put some anti-seize on here. So hopefully, if I ever have to take it off in the future, I don't have to go through the same issue that I did getting it on or getting it off. So let's put the rotor back on. And for this bolt and this bolt, it's gonna be 74 foot-pounds. Now something to note, since the Speed by Design kit comes with an all new clip as well as all new pins, on the passenger side of the vehicle, the way that you're going to put this clip in is with this little notch right here facing towards you. So just to compare, since on the factory one it has an arrow saying up, and on this kit it doesn't, you just want to match it to that. So you see the notch here on the factory clip, which is showing up. On the Speed by Design one, that means that the notch is going to be facing you. And then just like we did on the front, we're going to go ahead and lightly grease up the rear right here on the side of the pad. Now I would recommend starting with the top pin first, just because it's going to be easier to get in, since the bottom one it's already gonna have a lot of pressure on it. It's gonna be hard to hammer it in with this thing in here still. So start with the top pin. And then this is where it's gonna get a little bit tricky. But what I'd recommend doing, if you don't have somebody else to help you out with, like I do, you can push on this pretty hard, or you can push down on this with this hand and then hammer it from this side with your other hand. And that's it, and then the rear is done as well. These things have come out so freaking nice. Look how nice this thing looks right now. All right, with that, let me go ahead and get this rear wheel back on, and we'll go ahead and finish this job off on the other side, and then we'll go ahead and get the GTR out onto the road. Oh, the driver's side rear came out so freaking flush. Looks really good. All right, so I'm all cleaned up now, and what we need to go ahead and do is get the GTR out onto the road so we can start the bedding process on these new brakes. I have a few errands to run, and I gotta go to Harbor Freight and pick up a tool, not for this job, obviously, but for an installation video that I have coming up in the future. And while I'm doing that, I'm gonna walk you through my brake bedding process. So it's a pretty simple one, but I'll take you through how I go about bedding in new brakes. Let's go ahead and jump in the GTR and start the bedding process. Now, before I go ahead and pull the GTR out of the garage, something that I'd recommend doing anytime you change your brakes, go ahead and pump that pedal a little bit till you get that stiffness back in it, or you know, the tight pedal feel in it, just to give you a preliminary check whether you did this stuff correctly or not. The other thing is, as you're backing out of your driveway or wherever you're at that you're doing your brakes, go really slow and take your time. And the reason being, because if you screwed something up, now would be the best time to catch it, versus when you're going pretty quick on the road on a main street and then you find out that something is not working correctly. That could be very, very bad. My brake bedding process is actually quite simple. Basically what I do is I do 2 stops from 35 to 5 miles an hour just to get it a little bit warmed up. And then, very important, I'm never making a complete stop in this process, or at least I'm doing my best to try not to make a complete stop. And if I do have to make a complete stop, I'm not slamming on my brakes to making a complete stop. And I should have mentioned from the start, there is dozens of ways to bed in your brakes that people have a belief on doing. This is just the way that I've always done it, but there's several methods that you can go about doing this process. Then what I'm gonna do post those 2 stops is I'm gonna go to 60 miles per hour and bring it down to about 10 miles per hour. And I'm gonna do that 3 times. Then lastly, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna drive the vehicle for about another minute and just let the brake rotors cool off for a little bit. And that's all I do. Never have had any issues with bedding my brakes before. So right now the brakes are pretty warm, so we're gonna go ahead and do the first one. And with about 60% braking force, I'm braking down all the way to about 15 miles per hour, not making a complete stop. Now we'll do the second one, 60 miles per hour. This is the benefit on living on backcountry roads, because nobody's behind me. Okay, and then we have one more from 60. The other benefit of having a GTR is the fact that this thing can get to 60 really quickly. Now what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna cruise for about a minute, not hitting the brakes at all, and just let my brake rotors cool down a little bit. Now I will say this, I'm not here to sell you on my method of bedding in brakes. You can use whatever method you think works for you, or whatever method has worked for you before in the past. And the method that I'm using in this video is also not endorsed in any way, shape, or form by Speed by Design. So you're doing this all at your own risk. So just got over here to Harbor Freight Tools. Let's go ahead and head on inside and look for the tool that I need for my front lip and side skirts. Could it be in the auto body aisle? I am not seeing what I'm looking for here. What's this stuff? Auto lubrication, definitely not. All right, so I found the tool that I'm gonna need for doing the rivets, but I have not found the rivet size that I need, because these are all, oh, actually these are bigger. Never mind, I might've just found the size that I need. These look like they're gonna work. I think these should actually work out good. I'll show you all what I'm gonna need these for in a second. All right, so here's what I'm gonna end up with. A 13-inch heavy-duty professional hand riveter, along with these aluminum rivets. They are 1/4 by 1/2, and these should be plenty enough for what I need. I love going to Harbor Freight, but the one thing I'll say is every time I go in, I feel like there's a lot of stuff that I can still buy. Oh, look at the GTR right now. That thing looks so freaking nice. It never gets old staring at this thing. Anyways, while I'm out here in Winter Garden, I'm gonna head to one of my favorite boba spots. It's like right down the street from here, so I can't miss an opportunity to go and buy a Thai tea from this place. If you guys are ever in the Central Florida area, Lucky Straw's boba tea in Winter Garden, Florida is like super, super freaking good. All right, now time for some boba. Got my boba. I'm now a happy Bertini and off to the house. You know what's really nice about replacing the brakes too, that I just realized when I was in the parking lot? I had gotten into the habit of like lightly pressing my brakes just so they wouldn't squeal like crazy, because that thing is super embarrassing. You're driving around in a vehicle like this and then your brakes are squealing, and obviously most people have no idea that like that's also common even in performance brakes. They're just like, look at this super expensive car and he can't fix it. He can't even afford the brakes. But I notice now I'm gonna have to get used to just being able to brake like normal without having to like super, super lightly press the brakes and let off every time that they squeal. It was pretty embarrassing before. I noticed it's something super, super little, but to me made a pretty big deal. So overall, I think Speed by Design did a killer freaking job with this all-in-one brake kit, rotors, pads, front and rear. Something that I would recommend for those of you who are interested in purchasing this brake kit, I would highly recommend purchasing the titanium hardware, as well as something I wish I would have purchased, which is the low profile shims for the front. And the only reason I would recommend that is because I ended up trying to clean up mine, but they still were really, really like dark and dirty, and it would have been nice to have the really nice polished ones so I can have that brand new look to it. And who knows, maybe in the future I do end up purchasing those. And of course, you're gonna wanna stay tuned into my mileage update when I do that video on how these perform over the course of time. On that note, if you have not yet joined the community, go ahead, click that subscribe button and the notification bell. This way you can stay up to date on all of my GTR build series content. And don't forget, any of the products that I installed in today's video, you can go ahead and check out the description box below. I'll have links to everything in case you're interested in purchasing anything that I installed in today's video. With that being said, make sure you're putting out good energy into the world and you're paying it forward. I'll check y'all out later. Bye now.